We've all heard the legend of Genghis Khan, the master strategist who welded the steppe, tribes into a single force, and rose from a boyhood of hunger and betrayal to command the largest land empire history has ever seen. From the Pacific shores to the gates of Vienna, his name thundered across continents. Statues cast him in bronze. History books praise his genius on the battlefield. But the polished stories hide a darker engine that powered his rise. Behind the cavalry charges and brilliant tactics lay a system that treated people as raw material, a cold arithmetic where terror and reproduction built the state as surely as steel and horses. Few talk about how sexual, politics and calculated cruelty forged the Mongol war machine, or about the private laws that governed the men and women who lived and died inside the most feared court on earth. To uncover that hidden machinery, you have to look past the myth and into the records. The secret history of the Mongols, the Persian chronicles of Rashid Aline, the notes of European envoys like John of Plano Carpini. They describe a leader who understood that empires aren't built only with arrows. They are cemented with bloodlines, marriages, and the deliberate destruction of entire peoples. One practice became the blueprint for everything that followed. Long before he wore the title of Khan, Taigin burned with hatred for the Tartars, the tribe that had poisoned his father, Yasuj, and left his family destitute. By the year 1202, he was no longer a hunted orphan, but a rising conqueror. And when he cornered the last Tatar forces, his order was chillingly precise. Every male taller than the iron pin that held a cartwheel to its axle, roughly 3 feet, was to be executed where he stood. Imagine the scene. A boy is hauled forward, forced to stand beside a wagon as a guard measures him against the hub. One glance and his fate is sealed. The massacre swept away thousands. Only the women were spared, and they were not spared for mercy. They were seized as spoils, folded into the households of Taigin and his commanders. The most prominent and beautiful were taken as wives or concubines. Taigin himself chose 2 Tatar sisters, Yizugan and Yizui, to join his own camp. This was not a moment of uncontrolled vengeance. It was deliberate statecraft. The male line was to vanish, the female absorbed, the Tartar name erased in a single generation. Once tested, the formula was repeated. Years earlier, the Merkits had raided Taigin's camp and abducted his wife, Berta, a humiliation he never forgot. When his armies finally shattered the Merkit clan, their chief's widow, Tarna, was seized and later given to his 3rd son, Urgudai. That captive would one day serve as regent of the entire empire, wielding authority over princes and generals. Another step in the same design came with the Karites, former allies turned enemies. After crushing them in 1203, Genghis took the brilliant Karite noblewoman Sorgaktani Beki and arranged her marriage to his youngest son Toi. From that union were born Manka, Kubli Huligu, and Arik Berk, 4 grandsons who would each command vast dominions ruling China, Persia, and the Mongol heartland itself. A single political marriage had seeded an imperial dynasty. The message behind these acts was unmistakable: conquer, kill the men, take the women, and steal the future. By absorbing the defeated into his bloodline, Genghis ensured loyalty where none had existed, and wiped out the possibility of rebellion from the old male elite. The practice of slaughter and absorption became the silent cornerstone of Mongol expansion, as vital to its success as horse archers or siege engines. But control over reproduction was only one part of the structure. To keep a realm that spanned half the known world from splintering, Genghis needed a law that reached into every household, a code that bound soldiers, courtiers, and herdsmen alike. In 1206, on the banks of the Anon River, a great Kurai gathered the chiefs of the steppe. Taigin stood before them and was acclaimed as Genghis Khan, ruler of all the Mongols. Alongside his new title, he unveiled a hidden body of decrees known as the Yasa. Unlike other legal codes, it was not carved in stone, all written for public eyes. It was secret, known only to the Khan and his princes, but its reach was absolute and its penalties played out before all. The Yasa demanded loyalty, military discipline, and strict order in private life. Among its harshest rules were those governing sex and marriage. Adultery, whether committed by a man or a woman, peasant or noble, was punishable by death. Persian chronicler Ata Malik Juveni, who later served at a Mongol court, noted that while a man might take multiple wives and keep concubines, To even approach another man's spouse was a capital crime. The same fate awaited two unmarried lovers if they were discovered together. No matter how willing both had been, no chance to buy forgiveness. The Yasa's shadow stretched, from the yurts of common herders to the chambers of royal consort, binding every subject in a web of secrecy and fear. These intertwined strategies, the erasure of male lines, the folding of women into new families, and the iron discipline of the Yasa, formed the hidden architecture of Genghis Khan's rise. They explain how a nomadic warlord became master of half the earth, and why the empire he built carried scars far deeper than the tracks of hooves across the steppe. And as we turn to the next practice recorded in the chronicles, the picture only grows darker. This was never about worship or lofty ethics. It was about keeping the army sharp and the steppe united. A quarrel over a woman could tear a company apart. A fighter distracted by lust or jealousy wasn't watching the enemy. Under the Yasa, women were treated as possessions, and that property was guarded with deadly certainty. But the law's grip reached far beyond affairs. Death was also the sentence for sodomy, horse theft, treachery, desertion, or cowardice. Even small lapses could end a life. A rider who ignored something fallen from the man ahead could be slain on the spot. Relieving oneself in a river or spring meant execution. Washing clothes or bathing in running water during a march could draw the same fate. These were not senseless cruelties. They were survival strategies for a force living off the land. Polluted water could ruin an army quicker than swords. A foul camp meant sickness. A single careless soldier endangered thousands. The Yasa worked like the code behind a roaming war machine. Punishments were immediate, inevitable, molding a culture bound by obedience and fear. From battle to bedroom, every act was scripted. That discipline allowed a once minor tribe to command vast mixed armies and seize an entire continent order held in place by the constant threat of a swift, lonely death. If you prize stories carved from real chronicles, subscribe and stay with us. We're a lean crew, and every single subscription keeps these tales alive. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Genghis Khan's reach didn't stop at his soldiers. It radiated from his household, an immense moving pillar of state. At its peak stood 4 principal wives, each a formidable authority. First among them was Berthe, his companion since his youth. After victories, he installed 3 more senior consorts taken from fallen rulers, Kurlin of the Merkits and the Tatar sisters Yasujen and Yaseri. Each queen presided over her own court, camp, and staggering wealth. These were the famed ordos, palaces on the move. They weren't mere tents, but Roman capitals throbbing with trade and politics as they rolled across the plains. Persian vizier Rashid Alin, later historian of the Mongol Ilkhanate, described how they worked. Every order was assigned its own lands, its own dependents, and immense flocks of horses, sheep, and camels, sometimes tens of thousands strong. They functioned as self-contained economies. Beneath the 4 queens stretched a rigid chain of rank. The Khan kept many lesser wives and beneath them hundreds of concubines, organized in companies of 30 or 40. By his final years, Genghis is believed to have held roughly 500 women in his personal retinue. Such an intricate organism needed careful administration. Eunuchs taken from China's courts and Persia's palaces served as guards, stewards, and tutors inside these female-led centers. The women were anything but idle. They advised on policy, commanded networks of favors, and most crucially bore the empire's heirs. The ordos were the empire's nurseries, the crucibles of succession. Berte's 4 sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogadai, and Toli, would each inherit a quarter of the realm. None of this was driven by affection. It was production of heirs, of riches, of authority. Each ordo stood as a living monument to the Khan's triumph, fashioned from the human spoils of war. When Genghis Khan died in the summer of 1227, his dominion passed to his chosen successor, his 3rd son, Ogadai. Yet Ogadai received far more than banners, armies, and treasuries. He also absorbed part of his father's household, including junior wives. This was levirate marriage, an old steppe tradition scaled to imperial height by the Mongols. To foreignize it was appalling. Franciscan envoy John of Plano Carpini, visiting in the 1240s, wrote of it with open shock. A man might marry as many as he could maintain, and on his father's death, take all of his widows except his own mother. That boundary was absolute. No son could touch the woman who bore him, but every other wife, his stepmothers, belonged to the estate. no different from herds or tents. Love had no place here. The aim was to keep wealth, followers, and alliances inside the bloodline. A noblewoman came with livestock, attendants, and political weight. Levirate marriage locks those assets inside the clan. After Genghis's passing, Egodai brought several of the late Khan's wives into his own encampment. One M-carton was later gifted to a trusted general, proof that these women, once inherited, could be traded as rewards for loyalty. The habit didn't end with Ogodai. When he died, his son Guyuk absorbed the remnants of his harem. When Hulagu carved out a dynasty in Persia, he too practiced levirate, weaving inherited consorts into his new order. The pattern repeated through generations, a closed circuit where wives' status and fortune flowed from father to son, ensuring no shred of power leaked beyond the lineage. This is the point where policy turned into raw, calculated terror. The Mongol attack on the rich Khwarezmian Empire in 1219 started with one act of defiance. A Mongol trade mission was seized in Utra, its members slaughtered. Genghis Khan dispatched envoys demanding restitution. The Shah's answer was an outrage. One envoy executed, the others humiliated, their beards hacked away. To the Khan, this was more than insult. It was a challenge to his authority. His reply was not simply war, but devastation on a scale no one had yet imagined. What followed was warfare designed not only to crush resistance, but to obliterate entire cultures. Among the tools of that annihilation was organized sexual violence used deliberately to break a people's spirit. Contemporary Persian chroniclers Juveni and Ibn Alatha witnessed the aftermath and wrote of it without disguise. Whenever a city defied the Khan and eventually fell, the same terrible choreography unfolded. First, the entire population was herded beyond the walls. Artisans, smiths, scribes, engineers, and other skilled workers were separated from the crowd, living spoils destined for Mongolia to strengthen the empire. Next, the most attractive women and the youngest children were claimed, divided among the warriors as concubines and servants. Left behind stood a trembling mass, the old, the infirm, the unskilled. Then the killing began. But before the blade or arrow came humiliation. The sources recount soldiers committing mass rape in plain view of husbands, fathers and children. It was systematic degradation meant to crush resistance forever. It happened at Bukhara, at Samarkand, at every fortress that dared defy. Urgent fought so fiercely that when it finally fell, the Mongols slaughtered its inhabitants, and then breached the dikes of the Amudaya, drowning the ruins to erase every trace of life. At Nishapur, April 1221, tragedy reached a new depth. An arrow from the city had killed Tokachar, a royal son-in-law. His widow, Genghis's own daughter, demanded revenge so absolute that no living thing remained. Historian Juveni records that to ensure non-feigned death, everybody, even dogs and cats, was decapitated. Skulls were piled into ghastly towers. The claim that 7 million perished there strains belief, but the number serves as witness to the scale of destruction. This was not mindless bloodlust. It was calculated terror, a warning to the next settlement. Yield at the first sight of the Mongol standard, or be erased. Each outrage meshed with the others, gears in a single ruthless mechanism. The Yasa's iron code molded soldiers into disciplined weapons. That army conducted wars of extermination, capturing untold thousands of women. Through mass marriages and concubinage, those captives were absorbed, their identities stripped, their bloodlines woven into the growing dominion of the Mongol elite. Inside the great ordos, the rolling palaces of the queens, they produced heirs. And through lever marriage, those heirs inherited not only flocks and estates, but also their father's surviving wives, consolidating every asset within the clan. Conquest, absorption, reproduction, a cycle feeding the most explosive imperial expansion history had ever seen. Cities raised by the Mongols have long since risen again. The secret text of the Yasa is gone. The grand ordos, once parading across the steppe, have disappeared into legend. Yet something endures, silent, indelible, carried in the cells of millions. In 2003, a team led by geneticist Chris Tyler Smith published a landmark study in the American Journal of Human Genetics. Analyzing Y chromosome data from across Asia, they detected an extraordinary lineage. A single paternal signature passed almost unchanged from father to son present in about 8% of men living across what had been the Mongol Empire. Globally, that is roughly 1/1% of the entire male population, around 16 million men today. Using mutation rates, the researchers traced the lineage to one common ancestor who lived in Mongolia roughly a millennium ago. The data could not specify a name. Genetics cannot pin history's labels to a strand of DNA, but only one figure fits the time, the place, and the breathtaking reach required to leave such an imprint. Genghis Khan, aided by the sons who carried his campaigns across continents, his wars, his law, his household, and the vast machinery of conquest left behind, not just chronicles or ruins, but a biological empire stretching from the Pacific to the Caspian. The chroniclers inscribed his victories. The palaces crumbled into dust. Yet the bloodline, silent, invisible, coursing through the veins of millions, remains the last unalterable line in the Kane's account book. Land and cities can be lost, archives can burn, but genes endure. Hidden inside humanity itself lies Genghis Khan's final dominion, not carved into stone or claimed on parchment, but encoded in living flesh, a legacy as vast and unyielding as the steppe he once rode.